Perfect.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's start. To begin, let's acknowledge that Queens is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory, and we are grateful to be able to live, learn, and play on these lands. Can we go to the next screen, please? Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is the OCAS safety policy. So it's OCAS stands for Off-Campus Activity Safety Policy. We're going to talk about the process of doing your research for traveling to your host country, the types of things that you're going to need to look for and be prepared for travel, and also to make sure that you are looking at any potential hazards. And in particular, when you're doing your OCAS record, you're going to need to do a comprehensive risk assessment. But at the same time that you're looking at the different information about your host country, also think about it from your own personal health and safety perspective, what you feel comfortable with as you're going through this process. We want to make sure this year is a little bit different than other years. There's still a lot of uncertainty involved around travel, what that will look like in a couple of months, that will look like in the fall or the winter. And for each of us, we need to make sure that we're thinking about the situation that we find ourselves in and how comfortable we feel traveling at this point. Okay, so once you're doing your research, it's not just about a health and safety perspective for the OCAS process, it's also looking at it from your own personal perspective and whether or not this is the time that you feel comfortable in traveling. Okay, so the OCAS goals. What is OCAS? OCAS, all off-campus activities that happen off-campus, so not just outside of Canada, but anything off campus falls under the OCAS policy. There are three main goals. The first one is to meet the university's obligations, both legal and moral, with respect to the health and safety of all of our members of its community when participating in off-campus activities. As I said before, this is not just students. This also pertains to staff and faculty. And the process that you're going to go through in completing your OCAS safety planning record in order to have it approved in time to be able to go and travel. Just be aware that all staff and faculty that do anything outside of Canada at this time are going through the same process that you are and the same types of guidelines. The second one is to increase the level of awareness of safety issues among individuals in off-campus activities. It doesn't matter where you go or what you do, there's inherent risk in basically anything that we do, certainly in traveling outside of the country, but even in traveling downtown. There's always some type of risk, and we make decisions about the level of risk that we're comfortable with on a daily basis. So this is the kind of thing that we want you to tap into a little bit deeper in when you're researching your host country. Okay, there may be some things that are going to be very different than what you would normally expect to be exposed to in your everyday life. The third goal is to exercise due diligence in identifying and managing the risks inherent in off-campus activities. We, as the institution providing these types of opportunities for all of our community members, are required to ensure that when you go abroad, that you are going abroad with a good sense of what to expect. You've considered any potential hazards or risks ahead of time. You've made a plan on how you're going to mitigate any potential risks. And if anything should happen, you already have a plan on exactly how you're going to manage it. Okay, Jacoba, we can move to the next screen, please. How do you get to the OCAS website? It's on the main page of the Environmental Health and Safety. If you go under the OCAS tab, You'll see the emergency box on the left-hand side of the screen, and the fourth bullet point is the OCASP login. That is where you're going to actually log into the OCASP system. You'll need your QueensNet ID in order to do so. And that page alone will also have additional resources that we'll mention throughout this performance or this presentation. Jacoba, we can go on to the next one. Okay, so once you first log in, you're going to go to the planner's menu page, and this is what it's going to look like to you. Right now, every single one of you are going to fall under the higher risk activity. Okay, normally undergraduate students going on exchange outside of the country automatically fall under the higher risk category. Graduate students, it's a bit of a gray area. It really depends on where they're going, what they're doing, what type of support they are having for their activity. But in this particular pandemic period, everybody traveling outside, well, everybody traveling outside of Kingston right now would fall under a higher risk activity. So when you first log in, at the top of the page, you're going to see higher risk activities. You're going to click on the first option. When you first log in, you'll only have one option. It will be create a new safety planning record, which includes registering in the emergency support program. Once, you don't have to finish your record all in one sitting. Anytime that you want to stop, you're just going to hit save and quit at the bottom of whatever particular screen you're at, and then you can come back to it later on. But when you log in the second time, you're going to see this second option, which says continue with an existing or archived safety planning record. So make sure that if you don't finish it in one setting, when you come back in, hit the second button. Otherwise, it's going to continue to create a new record, and it'll probably cause you some frustration thinking that all of your information you've already put in there has been lost. Okay, so we're going to go on to the next slide. In the activity details page, once you log into the planner's menu page, it's going to automatically bring you into your record. This is the second page of the screen and probably one of the most important screens. This particular top part of this page is going to route your record to whoever is responsible for approving your record. Now, all students that are undergrad students going on exchange or an international letter of permission are all going to choose the first option, which is I am undertaking an undergraduate academic exchange, and then select your host institution from the drop-down menu. All of the host institutions should be in there, but if you are completing your record and you don't see your host institution, you can fire off an email to OCASP and just let me know that it's not there, and I'll add it to the list, but it should actually show it. For any of the MIB and the MBA students, you're going to select the fourth option. Down at the bottom of this particular box, it says, I am undertaking one of the following activities, which includes graduate exchange. Hit that button. Once you open it up, it's going to give you another drop-down menu, and MIB, MBA are all in that drop-down menu. So just make sure that you select the right one, okay? For the undergrads, just so that you're aware, the Department of Environmental Health and Safety is actually the person in authority that is going to approve all of your records, okay? So I will look at the initial review with you, and I will work with you until it is ready to go up to my boss, Dan Langham, who is the Director of Environmental Health and Safety, and he will do the actual final approval. For the MBA and the MIB students, you are going to be approved through your department, and it will actually be our Ellison Darling who is going to do that approval, okay? So now we can go to the next screen.
Sandra,
Yes.
We have a question on when should we do this? Before leaving on the exchange?
Oh, absolutely. I'm going to get to deadlines later on in the process, but for all undergraduate exchange for fall and any of the MBA or MIB students going out in fall, your deadline to have your record not just submitted but approved is going to be July 1st. Okay. And for any of the MBA or MIB students that are going out in the summer term, your deadline is going to be April 1st to have it submitted and approved. Okay, so for the people that are going in the summer with the April 1st deadline, you're going to want to get to it as soon as possible. Okay, it can take about 3 weeks for the process to go through the entire process. If there is any rejections that need to go back to the student, back to you for to address maybe some additional items and resubmit and then go through the process. Anybody that is going in the fall term, I would still strongly recommend that you start the process sometime in April, May, certainly at the latest. Okay, just because for the fall term, there's going to be a lot of records coming in for us to review and approve. So the process ends up taking just a little bit longer with just Dan and I to review all of your records. Okay. I hope that answered your questions. Tracy, was there any more questions?
There's a few more.
Okay.
First, they're asking where this recording is going to be posted. Somebody has asked.
Okay, from what I know, it's going to be, I know that I talked to Angie in Smith School of Business. It's going to be in the portal. Tom Galini is on here as well. Tom, will this be sent out in an email to students on your end, or?
We'll be following up with all arts and science students to let them know where it's posted. We don't have a specific link at the moment.
Okay. It will be made available, and I think that there will also be probably an email that will go out to all participants to let you know where you can find it.
Another question is,
Yeah.
my exchange is moved online. Do I still have to do this?
Okay. Where are you currently located? Maybe it helps if I say this. If you are at home right now and you are going to do your full exchange while you're at home virtually, and there's no chance that you are actually going to be traveling for your exchange, then no, you actually don't fall under the OCASP policy. The OCASP record itself, the process to complete the OCASP record is particular or specific to actually traveling outside of Canada.
Sandra, can I just add something there? I just want to be clear, because I know this question came up at our pre-departure session as well. And we haven't confirmed any virtual exchange as of yet for September. So if it's a commerce student that's asking, once we get to that point, if you're talking about a virtual exchange, then we can discuss that at that time. If you're going to be, as Sandra said, either staying in Canada or your home country, you wouldn't need to do it. But as of right now, we do not have virtual exchange confirmed for anyone. So we are going forward and asking everyone to complete this as though you are going to physically be out of the country for exchange.
Another question is, somebody's asked, when will we be given our Queen's email? People accepted for September 21 have not been given it yet.
This one I'm going to actually have to defer to either Jakoba or Tom. I'm not sure of when that information will actually come out to students.
I'm not sure if maybe this is a grad student asking. If that's the case, once you get your acceptance letter from Queen's University, you should have a net ID attached with that, and you can create your email address from that net ID. There should be instructions on the portal if you have access to your portal. If not, then you can email into the program office and we can make sure that we get the information out to you, the instructions.
Yeah, I think just to add on to that, I think maybe if you're asking a question, it could be really helpful if you just indicate which faculty you're in, because if it is a faculty specific question, that means we can just give you a bit more of a detailed answer. Thanks, folks.
And then what if there are multiple university destinations you are attending? Which university do you choose?
You're going to multiple destinations?
It says, what if there are multiple universities / destinations you are attending? Which university do you choose?
I'm not aware of that situation, so I'm not sure.
Yeah,
If it's,
So-
sorry, go ahead, Tom.
There is an arts and science program, TriSet, where you go to St Andrews and also National University of Singapore. So actually for those students, you would, I believe, be doing 2 because that's the way that OCAS is set up. So you would want to choose St Andrews first, if that's where you're going first, and then complete your second OCAS before you head off on your second bit. But if you are actually traveling around, or, you know, I will leave the answer to Sandra, but yeah, if you're TriSet, we'll send you a reminder for all that.
Yeah, maybe send me an email also to ocasp@queensu.ca. And give me a little bit more detail, because there might be a way that we can facilitate both destinations in one record and save you some time and energy. So just send me an email to ocasp, ocasp@queensu.ca. Okay, if we don't have any more questions.
Oh, there's a few more questions. Do you want to hold a question Q&A session at the end, Sandra, because they're piling up?
Yeah,
That way
maybe.
you can get through.
Yes, I think that's probably a good idea.
Okay.
So this is going to be the lower part of the activity details page. You're going to be asked to whether you're going outside of Canada or not. And as soon as you hit yes, it's going to open up the box and give you a little bit more information that you're going to need to put in. So the first one, when it asks if you were a citizen of the country that you're traveling to, or if you're a dual citizen, what we want to know is, do you have dual citizenship with the country that you're traveling to? You may have dual citizenship, but not to the area that you're going to. What we're really trying to figure out here is, are you a citizen, or do you have dual citizenship with the country that you're traveling to? We're going to want to know what citizenship you're traveling under. It's a drop-down menu. We're going to need your passport number. If you don't have your passport number right now, if you're in the process of having your passport updated, renewed, or anything like that, you can just put TBD, to be determined, for now, and you can always send us the new passport number once it's done. Don't hold up the process by waiting until you actually get your new passport. Then you're going to choose the country of activity that you're traveling to and geographical site or institution of your activity. Then in the setting for activity, most of you will be urban, but there are a few different options there. Nearest city to the activity location. For the types of activities that you're doing, you're probably all going to be in a major city. Just put the city location, and then the distance to nearest city would just be 0. This is a generic form, so that usually would only come into play if you were in a very remote location. Can we move forward? Okay, so now we're going to get into the itinerary page. At the top of the page, you're going to put the departure date that you're leaving Canada or your home country to travel to your host country, and the date that you expect to return. Right now, probably nobody has any plans confirmed, nor should they. So just put the date the earliest date that you expect that you might be traveling and the latest date that you would expect to be returning, either to Canada or to your home country. Then in the bottom, there should be at least 2 steps. What we want is the first step that indicates where you think you're going to be flying out of. So what city or what country are you going to be flying out of if you haven't narrowed it down yet, and into the airport that you're going to be traveling to. And then a second step, where you would expect to be flying out of to return back home. Okay. Right now, as I said, with no travel dates planned, those should be the only 2 steps that are there right now. Don't worry about when you actually do confirm your travel plans. We can always update your record later on. Okay. So next screen, please. Once you've completed that part, you're going to be taken into the pre-departure training modules. The pre-departure training modules are mandatory for all undergrads going outside of Canada. So you will not actually be able to complete your record and submit it for approval unless you have completed the pre-departure training. For the graduate students, it is not mandatory, but it is strongly recommended, especially in this current situation. There are 4 tabs across the tab. Introduction, which is basically some good information about your safety abroad and emergency support, tips for traveling. Orientation is going to talk about other things like currency, banking, different financial type information, flights. It's probably also going to touch on academic systems abroad. So a bunch of different information that you will find useful. And then the third tab is the culture tab. That particular section probably has about 4 or 5 little videos. Same with the other ones. They're small, about 10 to 15 minute videos. And then at the end, you're going to be asked a yes or no question to confirm that you understood the information and move on to the next one. Once everything is green, then you can move on and complete the rest of your record. Field studies is very specific to remote type research activities. So that is not something that is going to be required. Okay, so we can move forward on that one. Okay, so now we get to the hazards and risks part of the record. This is the part that is going to take the most amount of time and energy on your part. This is where you really have to look at, you have to do the research on your host country. You have to look for any types of potential hazards or risks that you could be exposed to, how you might expect to mitigate those risks, and then what actions you will take if it does happen. So at the top of the page, you're going to see what you see at the screen here. It's separated into 2 sections. The top section is hazards and risks that are related to the activity. For the types of activities that you're doing, this would probably not be applicable to you. What we're looking for here is part of your activity abroad going to entail something like scuba diving that is mandatory, not a personal option or a recreational activity that you might choose to do. What we're looking for here is any types of higher risk type activities, rock climbing, skydiving, anything like that, that might actually be a mandatory part of your activity. And I'm probably thinking that that's not going to relate to any of you. Once you'll see here that it's opened up into 3 boxes. The first one is, what is the hazard? So that could be something, I'm just going to give you an example, scuba diving. The risk, the next box is, what is the risk to you? So that could be, I could end up, we went very far ahead.
I'm so sorry. It keeps just going off on me and I'm not sure why. I'm really sorry.
Okay, sorry about that. So what is the risk to you? Okay, that could be injury, death if it was skydiving. And then the last box is how are you going to mitigate it? So that's where you're going to put the steps on. I will make sure that I go with a licensed instructor, that I will take the health and safety scuba dive training first before I travel. I will make sure that my insurance is going to cover me for these types of activities. That kind of a thing is what we're looking for in that particular section. So that is the top of the record. As I said, you're probably going to just choose no, not applicable for this one, and go to the lower part. So we can go on to the next screen. And the next screen is all of the risks and hazards that are specific to the country that you're going to. There's a whole bunch of different categories here. You can either choose yes or no. If you're a graduate student, it's going to ask you whether or not it's applicable. If you're an undergrad student, it's going to automatically open them. And if, for instance, under recent updates, if there isn't anything under recent updates, you would just put not applicable in the boxes or NA. Okay. If you're a grad student, you can just close that box off by choosing not applicable. There's a bunch of different categories here that we've tried to separate. At one point, we matched it completely with Global Affairs Canada because that is the authority that Queen's recognizes and where we're going to send you to do research on the country. So we tried to match it directly with them, but unfortunately they keep changing their website. So we've tried to keep those tabs as generalized as possible. Okay, we're going to go on to the next tab and we're going to touch on each one of these categories a little bit later. So Global Affairs Canada, we're going to send you to their website. In the actual application, when you're in OCASP, there will be a link. There'll be two links. One is going to take you directly to Global Affairs Canada. It's going to open it up in another window so that you can look at it at the same time that you're completing your record. And then there's another one that is going to take you to International SOS, who also has country profiles for many countries around the world that you can also use for your research. Again, that will also open in a separate window and you can look back and forth. We're going to kind of concentrate right now on Global Affairs Canada. They right now have 7 tabs: advisories, security, entry and exit requirements, health, laws and culture, disasters and climate, and help abroad. So we're going to touch on each one of these. Can we move forward, please? Okay, so this is what a country profile will look like. I just chose a random one. You'll see the tabs across the top where it says risk levels, safety and security, entry and exit, health, laws, and culture. So those are the tabs that are going to match in with the different categories when you're completing your record. The one category that it doesn't show on here, it says assistance on theirs. In the OCASP application, it actually says government contacts. Okay, so we can move forward to the next slide. Okay, so now we're going to kind of look at what we're looking for in each one of these particular areas. Under advisories, under that first tab, the country profile is going to tell you the risk level of the country. There's 4 different types of risk levels. There's take normal security precautions. That would be the same as what you would expect at home, either in Canada or in your home country. Experience or exercise a high degree of caution, maybe something that you might need to prepare a little bit more than what you would expect at home. And then there's 2 final categories. One is avoid non-essential travel and one is avoid all travel. These are actually called travel advisories that the government indicates when there is a particular activity going on or something happening within the country where they will not allow you or they will recommend that you not travel. These two categories are something that Queen's takes quite seriously. Normally, we would follow the recommendations of Global Affairs Canada, and we would not approve any travel to countries that have what is called a level 3 or a level 4 advisory. Right now, you'll probably find when you're doing your research through GAC, Global Affairs Canada, it will show a travel advisory right now for COVID. There is an exemption process right now for some students, especially graduate students. They're looking at traveling right now that may be granted an exemption to travel while that advisory is on. Okay, so don't worry about the travel advisory right now. Let's hope that by the time you are actually going to be traveling, that the world is looking quite different than it does right now. We can move on to the next slide. The next one is the security section. What you're looking for in really all of these categories is it something that has the potential to cause me harm or injury? Is it something that could have a significant negative impact on me? Or is it something that's completely out of the norm of what I could expect to be exposed to in my everyday life? Okay, something like that could be myself coming from Canada, traveling to the UK. I would not be used to traveling on the left. So that would be something that would be outside of my normal response and could be a potential hazard to me because I wouldn't necessarily be automatically looking for traffic on the right. Okay, so under the safety and security, you're going to look through the tabs very carefully. And Global Affairs Canada will give you a lot of detail. Again, you're going to look for things that might cause you harm. Crime is something that would be on every record, as it is here. There's always a level of crime somewhere, and probably it would be similar to what you would be exposed to here. In that case, your risk management plan is going to be very similar to what you would do here. Okay. Looks like we have been jumped forward again. Sorry about all this, everybody. The other thing is traffic directs on the left, as I already mentioned. Anything to do with public transportation, they will give you detailed information. Look for things like, are there different types of taxi cabs? Are there official and non-official taxi cabs? And is there any additional risks that are being mentioned through Global Affairs Canada on one particular type of travel? Okay. If so, you're going to want to indicate that you're aware of it, and either you would avoid unofficial taxis, make sure that you call for a taxi ahead of time, that you use an appropriate taxi stand, something like that, and that you would be a little bit more aware when you're traveling. Okay, mountain activities. If I mentioned earlier that if you were planning on doing recreational activities, you don't need to indicate it on your record. However, for any of you, if you were thinking about doing anything like mountaineering, skiing, or any other type of what insurance providers would consider a higher risk activity, you would want to make sure that even for yourself, check with your health insurance provider first to find out if you would be covered if you choose to participate in them. A lot of people don't understand that some insurance providers might not cover you. They might think the risk is too high and they won't cover you. Or they'll cover certain parts, but they won't cover things like search and rescue. So it's just something for yourself. If you're planning on doing any type of recreational activities, just check with your insurance provider first to find out if there's any clauses in your policy that would not cover you. Okay, so we can move on to the next The next one is entry and exit requirements. What we're really looking for here is anything that is going to stop you getting into your country, stop you getting onto a plane to even travel to your host country, or anything that's going to keep you from leaving your host country. So any visa or passport requirements. Are there any types of importation or exportation requirements? Is there anything that you can't bring into the country? Is there any kind of restrictions on printed material, electronics, anything like that? You want to make sure that you know ahead of time. Is there any requirements around how much currency you can bring into a country or how much you can bring out? You want to make sure that you have all of this information before you travel. You don't want to get all the way to your host institution and be turned around. We did have a situation a number of years ago where a couple of students went to Ireland to study, and one of them forgot to bring their documentation from Queen's saying that they were a student traveling to study in Ireland. And once they arrived in the airport in Ireland, they were actually turned away and had to come back home. So it's that kind of stuff that we're looking for. Is there anything that you need to have with you? Do you need any documentation or particular documents from your faculty indicating that you are studying at your host university? Okay. And is there any COVID-19 travel requirements? There's probably all kinds right now, and it's ever changing. So it's something that you're going to kind of have to monitor. Even if you look at it now, something that you're going to have to monitor regularly before there is a decision made whether or not you can actually travel in fall. Okay. Tracy, did you have your hand up?
No, I don't.
We can move forward then. COVID-19. This is a big issue right now. The first thing that all of you will need to do and make sure that you indicate it on your record. Will your health insurance provider cover you for COVID-19 related illnesses? We have found that there are a number of providers right now that are not covering COVID-19 related illnesses. You want to make sure that if you're traveling, that you will be covered. So if you did not opt out of the university's insurance plan, that would either be the AMS for undergraduates or the SGPS for graduate students. Contact them directly, because if you didn't opt out, you're automatically enrolled. Okay, so contact them, find out what you're covered for, talk to them about your particular health and where you're going, and find out if there's any other things that might not be covered. Talk about your health, any pre-existing conditions, how would you use your policy when you get there? Do you have to let them know when you're traveling? Get all those details ahead of time, but definitely find out if you're going to be covered for COVID-19. If not, look to purchase additional supplemental coverage through another provider that will cover COVID. Okay. Some of you may also be required to have insurance coverage at your host institution. So reach out to them as well. Find out what is covered under their policy. Okay. If you are a European citizen and you're going to be in Europe and you have your own personal coverage, reach out to your private insurance coverage, or if you're covered through your parents, reach out to them, ask the same questions. Okay. The other thing that you're going to want to know is, will you be required to quarantine when you arrive? Right now, most areas will require some type of quarantine. Find out from your host institution if this is something that is provided, or if this is something that you have to provide or determine on your own. Okay. Your record will also need to show what that plan is, what you expect to be doing. Okay. Will you be required to have proof of a negative test, or will you be required to take a test when you arrive in your host institution? You may be required right in the airport to have another COVID-19 test done, find out if you're going to have to pay for that. You should be able to find out through the Global Affairs Canada country profile. If not, contact the government or embassy of your citizenship in your host country to find out what those requirements are. Or if you're talking to your flight provider, they also may be able to give you that information. The other thing that might come up is, are there any requirements around the COVID-19 vaccine? At present, I'm not seeing that, but it's ever changing. So keep a good eye on what you will be required to prove traveling to your host country and then traveling back home. Okay. Prior to confirming your travel plans, we strongly encourage you to purchase a round trip ticket with adequate cancellation insurance on your flights should you need to change your departure date for illness or through the current pandemic situation. We have seen, this morning I saw that Italy is now starting to lock down again. So you never know right now what is going to happen. So make sure that you have a ticket. It's usually easier if you have a round trip ticket to change that flight ticket back. The other thing that is going to be something that you're really going to need to consider is the full financial risk involved in traveling abroad right now. When the pandemic really hit and everything started to close down and we were bringing everybody home, there was a lot of people that could not leave at the time that they wanted to, or with ever-changing restrictions on flights being canceled, they weren't able to leave. Some students were stuck abroad basically for weeks, if not a couple of months, that they had to pay that additional cost for. So they were paying additional accommodations. They were then forced to get different flights to come back home that were much more expensive. So it's really looking at the time that you're expecting to go and trying to think of those unforeseen circumstances and making sure that you're going to be able to navigate that situation if you are stuck longer. Okay, so making sure that you have those resources. And if you feel that at any time during this process that maybe traveling right now for the fall is not something that you're comfortable with, reach out to your faculty and let them know that as soon as possible, okay? But otherwise, definitely something to consider. There was a lot of people, as I mentioned, that ended up spending a lot more money than they anticipated, okay? So we're gonna move on to the next slide. The next one is health concerns. So basically, are there any particular immunizations or vaccines that you are required to have to travel to your host country? Most of the time, that probably won't be, but there could be down the road if somebody is looking for the COVID-19 vaccine. I don't think any of you are going to be traveling to a country where yellow fever is present right now and would require an immunization, but it's looking at that type of stuff. Is there anything that you might need ahead of time? If you're not sure, you can reach out to any travel clinic, usually at any pharmacy, and they would be able to provide you with that information. Also look at, are there any current outbreaks or diseases or illnesses in your host country? And if so, how are you going to mitigate that? Okay, right now it's going to be all about COVID. What are the restrictions? How are you going to manage that? So that's the physical distancing, wearing a mask, hand sanitizer, washing your hands, that sort of thing. The other thing, air pollution, high altitude sickness would come in depending on if you were in an area where this would be a concern. There also might be areas that you're going to where there is limited medical care. If there is, reach out to my office and let us know where you're going. But initially, everybody, when you're having your conversation with your health insurance or your insurance provider around COVID, also ask them about emergency air evacuation. Find out if your policy will cover you if there is a serious illness or a serious injury, and will they fly you back home? Okay. If something happens and you're going to be in a hospital for 3 months, say, you would probably want to come back home. That type of flight would be extremely expensive. So you want to make sure that your policy is going to cover that. We didn't have to medically evac anybody out after COVID. International SOS, our third-party provider that we're going to talk about in just a little bit, did have to bring a number of people home for their other providers and their other education type institutions worldwide. And those costs are very expensive. So we can get you home, but the cost will then come from either your insurance policy or from you. So make sure ahead of time that they're going to cover emergency air evacuation. Any medication that you're going to be traveling with, find out what you need to have with you. Do you need a doctor's note? Do you need prescriptions with you? Is there a limit on any type, on the type of medication that you can bring, or the amount of medication that you can bring? Okay, all of that kind of stuff you want to know ahead of time before you travel. Okay, and just to find out if the medication that you are taking is legal in your host country. There is a lot of different types of medications that would be legal in Canada or in Europe and not in some other areas. So it's making sure that you do your research to find out if your medication that you're going to take with you, that you are required to take, is going to be covered. And if so, what type of documentation you're going to need to provide. Okay, so we'll move on to the next one. Laws and culture. So what we're looking at here again is certainly any laws or cultural norms that might be very different from when you're coming from. Anything that has a very high penalty involved. So there's lots of different types of laws around alcohol, photography of government buildings or embassies, illegal drugs, currency. Make sure you know what those all are. There's different regulations around gender, sexual orientation, public displays of affection that you need to be aware of for where you're going to. Canadians with dual nationality. This is where we asked you earlier what passport you're traveling on. If you are traveling on if you're using the dual citizenship passport to get into your host country, find out if there's any requirements around traveling into your host country on that passport. We had a situation many years ago where a Queen's student went to Switzerland to on exchange for a year. He'd never been to Switzerland, but he was a dual Swiss citizen. He thought it would be easier for him to travel abroad on his Swiss passport. So he traveled on that, and he was immediately detained in the airport for mandatory military service. We were able to get an exemption for him, but those are the types of things. Whatever passport you're traveling on, find out if there's any restrictions in the host country that you're going to. Okay. Are there any requirements around or laws around the type of clothing that you can wear? There's a lot of areas where military style or camouflage clothing is illegal. So make sure that you're aware of that. There's a lot of areas where common sense and discretion should be exercised in your dress and behavior. And there's a lot of different types of laws pertaining to driving a vehicle. If any of you are not planning on driving at all while you're abroad, just indicate under road travel that you will not be driving. And then you won't have to go into any detail about the laws around driving a vehicle. Okay, So we're going to go on to the next slide. Disasters and climate. What we're looking for here is anything that could happen in the time that you're traveling. So for instance, if you were traveling in the winter and hurricane season is June until November, you wouldn't need to identify that if you were leaving in January. So if you're leaving in the fall, or if you're traveling in the summer, for some of you, is there any types of natural disasters that could occur or that regularly occur in your host country that you would need to be prepared for? Okay. And there would be a lot of different things. What we're looking for here is that you'll stay up to date on what the weather reports are, but also that you're going to check with your host institution, especially in areas where earthquakes occur frequently. You want to know what their policies and protocols are. If there is an earthquake, what do you need to do? So find out what that information is, especially if you're staying in their residences. Okay. As I said, you only need to address any types of things that could occur in the time that you're going to be there. Okay. So we'll move on to the next slide. Help abroad. So this is where on the record, it actually says government contacts. If you're a Canadian citizen and you're traveling on your Canadian passport, then you're going to put the contact information for the Canadian Embassy or Consulate in your host country. Global Affairs Canada profile does show that information, and you can choose the one and you can copy and paste that directly into it. That is good for two things. One, for us, if we need to assist you for whatever reason while you're abroad, we'll know what the nearest embassy is to you immediately by looking at your record. But also for you, when you're abroad, you'll know what that particular embassy and contact information is. You can look it up quickly. If you're not a Canadian citizen, or if you're not traveling on a Canadian passport, make sure that you check for the embassy or consulate of your citizenship in your host country. And that is the information that you're going to want to have there. Again, if you're a dual citizen and if you are a dual Canadian, but traveling on a non-Canadian passport, just something to be aware of. If you're Canadian traveling on a non-Canadian passport, the Canadian government can't really provide you with much assistance. Okay. You're going to be looking at the embassy or consulate of the one that you're traveling on. Okay. We can move forward. Sorry, I need a drink. The next thing is special needs. You do not have to disclose to us. It's not mandatory that you tell us what your special needs are, but you still need to think about them. Okay. If you do put it on your record, it is actually, we encourage you to do so. That record is confidential. The only people that would see it is myself or my boss, and only for the purpose of approving or reviewing and approving your record, and only other than that if we needed to provide you with some assistance. Okay, so things like allergies to medication or food, especially any life-threatening allergies, it's always a good idea to put it on your record. If we need to support you in some way, we should have that information. Do you wear a medical alert bracelet or some other type of allergy identifier, and especially in the language of the country that you're traveling to? Make sure that you have that information on your person. If you are ill and are not able to communicate to a healthcare professional and you have a life-threatening allergy to any type of medication, you want to make sure that they are able to be aware of that, even though you can't communicate it. Anything like service animals or companions, you would need to know if there was any specific documentation for immigration that you would need. If you're traveling with EpiPens or insulin, look at how, not just the requirements for bringing anything in to do with insulin and EpiPens into your host country, but also how are you going to replenish it? You might have some with you. What happens if you use them and you need to get it replenished when you're in your host country? What are you going to need? Okay. And also make sure that you're going to have the proper storage for any types of medication. If you are required to take prescribed medication, again, make sure that you check to make sure that it's legal in your host country. Probably also a travel clinic can also assist with that. Some other types of common medications such as Tylenol, Advil, Benadryl, etc., might not be available in your host country, and you might want to pack some and take it along with you. And that's fine, but just make sure that you check the rules again on importing any of the medication that you're bringing in, especially anything that has an antihistamine in it. Some of that contains steroids and it would be illegal in some areas. So you just want to make sure that anything that you're taking with you is going to be legal in your host country. Okay. If you indicate on your record that you have a special need, you will need to indicate what that special need or allergy is and how you're going to mitigate it. So do you wear a medical alert bracelet? Do you have an EpiPen? Do you have information on your person if you can't communicate? The other reason why I say it's so helpful to be on your record, we have had instances where somebody has been ill. One of our students has been ill, taken to hospital. They weren't able to communicate, but they had one of our emergency support cards, which I'm going to tell you about in a few minutes. They had it in their wallet. The hospital found the card and called us. So we were able to immediately open up their record, find out what their health insurance provider was, did they have any medical needs, who was their personal emergency contacts, and contact them and the insurance provider before the student was even able to communicate afterwards. So if you have that card on you and you're not able to communicate, quite often medical professionals will call that number. Okay. We can move on to the next slide. And this is going to be the last page of the record. At the top, it's going to be the local emergency contact information. So what we're looking for here really is the 911 equivalent for your host country. Normally they would have it. So for instance, 112, usually for the UK, or 999. If your host country doesn't have a 911 equivalent, then just indicate the number for fire, police, and ambulance. The next one is, how will we communicate with you in the event of an emergency? So if there's something going on in your host country, we check the world news every day, 24/7, 365 days of the year. If there is something happening around the world, we open up the OCASP system, find who might be involved or in that area, and then we reach out to you. Initially, we're going to reach out to you via your email. If we can't get in touch with you within a 48-hour period, especially if it's something like a large-scale disaster, like an earthquake, we're going to then look at this information. Okay, so this is somebody that would know who you are, where you are. So for instance, if you're going on exchange, the international office at your host institution, if you have an actual contact of somebody in your host institution, indicate that here. That's really what we're looking for here. We would reach out to them next to say, look, we're looking for Tom Galini. We haven't been able to reach him in the last 48 hours. Can you confirm with us if you've seen him, if he's okay? All right. So we'll go on to the next slide. The next slide is going to show you the program overseeing activity. So everybody that is undergraduate student going on exchange, it's going to be your faculty. So it's either going to be Arts and Science International Programs Office / Exchange and Independent Study Abroad, or it's going to be Engineering / Exchange and Independent Study Abroad, or Smith School of Business. If it's MBA or MIB, that is what you're going to choose from the drop-down menu. The reason for that is it then automatically on the back end of the system that you won't see, it will attach the departmental contacts that our office would use if there was an emergency situation. Okay, the last part is personal emergency contacts. So this is going to be the information for 2 personal emergency contacts that you would want us to reach, that you would advocate that we would reach out to if we couldn't get in touch with you. So something's happening in your host country. We've reached out to you via email. We've tried your phone number that you had listed. We couldn't get a hold of you. So we contacted your host institution. They can't find you. Now we're going to reach out to whoever these 2 personal emergency contacts are to find out if they have heard from you. Okay, so it's just another layer, but make sure that whoever you put here and the numbers that you're giving us, especially the telephone number, is the number that they're going to be at for the duration of the time that you're abroad. Okay, and that can be anybody. It could be a parent if you want, it could be a friend, it could be any other family member, but just somebody you would authorize us to reach out to if we needed to confirm that you were okay. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next slide. At the end of the record, you're going to come to the summary page. There's going to be 1 of 2 things. One, it's going to say errors are highlighted in red. Look down the page, and everywhere where you see red, it's also underlined. So just in case you are colorblind, you would see it as underlined. And then there's an edit button beside that particular section. Hit the edit, it'll open up that page, put in the information, hit continue until you get back to the summary page that's got a green screen that says it's ready to be approved or it's ready to be submitted. Okay, can we go to the next slide, Jacoba? The next slide is actually, I missed one, sorry. When you hit the summary page, there will be another slide that I missed in the presentation that is just the acknowledgements. It just says that you are aware that there are some inherent risks involved in the activity that you're planning to do, and you consent to assume those risks. You're in good health to participate in these activities. So there's a number of different statements there that were drafted by Queen's Legal Counsel. Once you hit I agree, the system automatically seamlessly will send your record for approval. Okay. In the pre-departure section, there will be a final checklist. I do strongly recommend that you print that off or save it to your desktop if you wish. It's just going to give you some additional items that we are really going to be looking for when you're submitting your record, things that people quite often forget or miss on their record. Couple things to know about this. When you are in the process of completing your record, watch the screen carefully. Because of the new security protocols set by Queen's University and Queen's ITS, the system will time out after about a 10 or 15 minutes of inactivity. There will be a pop-up window that will come up that will say you're in progress. The system is going to close. Are you in progress? You would have to hit the progress yes. Then it saves your information. If you're completing your record and you get a phone call or you have to leave your computer, I strongly recommend that you hit the save and quit at the bottom of the page. That way, if that pop-up window comes up and you miss it, it will automatically lose everything. It won't save anything you've just done. Okay, so if you have to go and make a phone call, or you have to go and get something to eat, or you have to answer the door, just make sure you hit save and quit so that your information up until that point is saved. And then during the process, just make sure that you're mindful of that pop-up window. Okay. And as you're going through on each page, you'll see some little yellow hover over help buttons in different sections. If you just put your cursor over it, it will give you an example of what we're looking for in those particular fields. Okay. And you can also print that off if that is easier for you. Okay, we'll go on to the next slide. Okay, so what happens now? Your record has been submitted and it's going to be reviewed. If it's an undergrad, I'm going to review it first. Otherwise, it's going to go to Smith School of Business. So I'm going to look at it and I am required to do the exact same amount of research that you have just done on your record to ensure that I am aware of where you're going and I can ensure that you have identified any potential risks and how you're going to mitigate those risks. If there is something that is missed, I'm going to reject it. If your record is rejected, the system will automatically send you an email that says the record was rejected, and it will have a direct link that will take you right into your record. When you go in, you'll need to scroll through each screen. Any area that we need you to make modifications or maybe elaborate on the information that you've already included, those rejection comments are going to be at the top of the page that they pertain to. Okay, so look through, it'll be a pink box at the top of each page that there might be something we need you to address. Address those, click through the record until it's resubmitted. And we'll go back and forth. Same with if you're a graduate student, it will go back and forth with Smith School of Business until everybody agrees that, okay, this looks pretty comprehensive and it can go for final approval. At that point, the undergrads will go up to my boss. He will do the review that I've done, you've done, he will now do that. And then he will determine whether or not he agrees. If he agrees, you get an email that says your record has been approved. Otherwise, you could get another rejection where he is asking you for some additional information. Usually by the time it's gone past me, I work very closely with Dan Langham. So I have a pretty good idea of exactly the types of things that he's looking for. So usually by the time it gets past me, it should be fine and you'll get that record, or you'll get that email that says it was approved. At any time, if you're not sure, if you log into the OCASP system and you'll see the status of your record. So as if it says that it's pending review, that means it's either pending review by me or it's gone past me now. I'm happy with it and I've submitted it up to my boss for the final approval. At any time, if you're not sure about the status of your record, email ocasp@queensu.ca. Again, ocasp@queensu.ca, and I will let you know what the status is and where you currently sit. Okay. One thing that I will say for the undergrads especially, but for the MIB and MBA, something to be mindful of when you're doing the hazards and risk page. There's a lot of different things that can fall under one category. So for instance, safety and security, crime, terrorism, demonstrations that can turn violent, many other types of things. What we recommend is that you address them separately. Okay, so open up a different box and address crime separately, address terrorism separately, and address demonstrations or any other types of potential hazards individually. It's easier for us when we're doing the review, especially if we're looking at hundreds of records, to really be able to determine that you have addressed all of the potential hazards and that your risk management plan clearly shows how you're going to mitigate it and how you're going to stay informed when you're abroad. And should any of these potential hazards occur while you're there, what are the steps that you're going to take? So for instance, anytime that you find yourself in an emergency situation when you're abroad, the first thing that we're going to want you to do is call international SOS, other than 911. If you're robbed in country, call 911. But for anything else, call International SOS. They are going to provide you with the best support 24/7, 365 days of the year. Okay. Make sure that you indicate that you know what support is available to you when you're abroad. And we're going to talk a little bit more about International SOS in a minute. So let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so again, we're going to touch on the deadlines. So anybody that's going out in summer, the MIB and the MBA, April 1st is going to be the day that we're looking for yours to be approved. So you're going to want to start that pretty soon. The undergrads, you're going to be looking at July 1st, along with any of the MIB double degree that are going out later in the year. All of your dates are going to be July 1st. I would still strongly recommend that you start thinking and doing your research in April or May. Okay. It can take, as I said, 3 weeks or even 4 or 5 weeks, depending on the level of records coming in to be reviewed. So the sooner that you can get them in, the better it would be, because it might take us a little bit longer to get through to your record. But at any time during the process, once you have submitted it, anytime that you need to check on what the status is, just send me an email and I'll be able to answer that for you. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so emergency support and student services and resources while you're abroad. So investigate what services and resources are available to you at your host institution. Okay. Make sure that you have the contact information for International SOS. When you're completing your OCASP record, you are going to find multiple areas on the OCASP system and in your record where it's going to provide you with that information. Okay. There's also Queen's University. Make sure that you have our number as well, or your faculty here. Okay, so if it's an emergency situation though, make sure you call International SOS. If you are feeling concerned and you have some questions, but it's not necessarily an emergency situation, you might want to contact your faculty or us, our office directly, and that information is located on the record. Okay. Just make sure that you have that with you when you travel. You can contact us also, call collect. As with ISOS, you can call collect 24/7, 365 days a year. The other support that would be available to you is other students that are also on exchange from Queen's or from other institutions at your host institution. Okay. Next slide. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about International SOS and the support that they provide. They are the third-party provider that we contracted with to provide emergency support while students are abroad. In previous years, up until 2 years ago, Queen's used to provide all support. The problem with that was we had to rely on the government to get people home. We weren't able to provide counseling services to our students abroad. We weren't able to provide recommendations for health clinics or suggest particular health clinics where you are anywhere in the world. International SOS is going to be able to provide you with that. So with them, you have access to a global network of assistance centers and services that can help you with your travel, medical, and security needs. They also provide emotional support. So at any time, if you're feeling a little overwhelmed and you feel like you might need some help, by all means, you can call them at any time. They can provide you with a lot of support while you're abroad during an emergency situation, including things like medical or security extractions if that becomes necessary. If you are not feeling well, call them and they will be able to let you know give you a recommendation on who you should see, whether or not this is something they think is a little bit more concerning and you should go immediately to a hospital or a clinic. They will provide you with information on health clinics in your host country. And any of these recommendations that they provide you with are also going to be facilities that they have personally vetted themselves. Okay. And you will be able to talk to medical professionals as well. They also have security professionals. So while you're in your planning process and you're looking at you're doing your research on planning to travel and what potential hazards are there, ISOS can also provide you with the same information that Global Affairs Canada does. Global Affairs Canada does have a little bit of a political context and very heavy Canadian context. International SOS is a little bit more US context, but it will provide you with a broader amount of information than what you will find in Global Affairs Canada. If you want to, you can contact them before you leave. You can contact them now and say, hi, I'm Sandra Jeffers. I'm a student at Queen's University and I'm traveling to Kenya in fall. And I'm not really sure. I've done the research, but I want to talk to somebody that can give me some real information on what I should be prepared for and what the actual lay of the land is going to be. They will put you in touch with a security professional for that area, and they will send you a full report and they will check back in with you later. So it's not just something that you're going to reach out to if there's an emergency. You can reach out to them ahead of time. If your parents are concerned about certain aspects of you traveling right now, you can also reach out to ISOS on their behalf to get some additional information that might make them feel a little bit better as well. They will also, as I said, provide medical and security extractions when necessary. Next screen, please. And this is just a little bit more information of who they are. So they have 26 assistance centers worldwide now. They have 52 medical professionals on staff, 2,300 medical professionals on staff, and 1,000 medical services sites worldwide. They also have contracts with 81,000 accredited providers. Okay, so as I said, anywhere that they're going to recommend, they've already vetted ahead of time. You can talk to a medical professional. They can set up counseling services. So if you're feeling a little overwhelmed and you just need to talk to somebody, reach out to them. They will be able to set you up either with virtual counseling or potentially in-person counseling in your host institution, as they do have a number of assistance centers in various locations worldwide. So at any time, if you feel like you're overwhelmed or you have some real concerns or you feel like your safety and security is being threatened in some way, contact them, okay? And they're going to provide you with some good, solid help. They will also then provide us with updates. Okay, next slide. So this slide you'll be able to click for the different information here, but it's also in the app. Okay, so on the emergency support page, there's a link for the International SOS Assistance app. We strongly recommend that you download that before you go. You want to have that on your person. You can text them immediately if there's an issue while you're traveling, or if there's any type of a situation or a concern that you have, you can reach out to them immediately. So make sure that you download the app before you go. It's going to make getting some type of assistance and support a lot easier for you while you're abroad. You'll also need to set up the ISOS account. Again, the OCASP system, as you're going through that last page, does have the links and gives you the direct information on how to set up the account. And it will give you the account policy code for Queens, okay? You will also be able to download the International Travel Emergency Contact Card. We're going to also send that, I'm going to send that information out in a separate email to the faculties who then can provide it to all of you. But make sure, in previous years, we would be doing these types of sessions in person, and we would give you the cards in your hands so that you could put it in your wallet. Make sure that you download it and you have that information on your person. Again, for those situations, it's very rare. It rarely happens, but if you are taken to hospital and are not able to communicate, if you've got that information in your wallet or somewhere in your purse somewhere, they would be able to contact us and we would be able to start providing support, reaching out to your parents, reaching out to your insurance provider, making sure that things were being dealt with immediately, even though you weren't able to communicate at that time and get things started on your own. Okay. Next slide. Questions?
I have lots of questions, Sandra.
Okay.
So bear with me here. Do I have to apply for travel exemption after this?
No, not for the MIB and the MBA going in summer, check with the faculty office. That would be a different answer right now. For everybody that is going in fall, no. What we're doing right now is we're all waiting and hoping that for fall, travel will be allowed to travel. There will be an announcement coming out from the university. I would expect sometime in the near future, but it may not be until about May. So make sure you start your records ahead of time, okay? With the assumption that you will be traveling. Then there will be something that's going to come out that will detail the university's stance right now. Hopefully, that will still go forward in fall. We're just not sure how that's going to plan out right now, but you will not need an exemption for that. Okay. Now having said that, if there is a university stance that we are suspending all travel in the fall, if there was still people that really strongly wanted to go anyway, then you would need to go through the exemption process. But right now, don't worry about it unless you're the MIB or MBA going in summer. Check with the faculty office, okay?
How can I follow up with the approval of an OCASP application?
Okay, so after, I'm assuming after a record is submitted for approval, you will receive emails once, if it's rejected, telling you that it's been rejected and you need to address certain items. Or you will get an email directly that will say your record has been approved. At any time, as I said, it could take a number of weeks before we get to your record, before it's gone through the whole process. At any time, email OCASP, OCASP @queensu.ca. I will be able to update you on the status of your record. If you have any questions or technical issues with the OCASP system, reach out to me. If you have any questions about the research that you're doing and the risk process, the risk assessment process, send me an email at ocasp@queensu.ca. Basically, any questions that you have about that process, send them to me and I will be able to respond. I tend to respond within a 24-hour period, usually a few hours.
Next question is, what if my home is in Europe and I will not be coming back to Canada?
Okay, and that's quite possible. So when you return, your return date then should be that you're returning to your home country. Now, Having said that, you may be finishing your program, say in December, and then you're going to do personal travel afterwards. At that point, if you're not going to go straight home, indicate that the end of your program date is the end of the program on your record. You do not have to address any personal travel on your record. Okay, so if you go ahead of time to do a little bit of personal travel before you start your program, or if you're going to do personal travel at the end of your program, you don't have to address those countries or any travel to those countries on your record. All we're looking for is that you've looked at your host country that is part of the sanctioned activity. That's what we're responsible for. Any type of personal travel, then you are responsible for on your own. The only thing that I would say is if you're going to do personal travel, just make sure that you've done a little bit of research on the other areas that you're planning to go for personal travel so that you can be prepared in those areas. Okay.
Next question is, if we don't know our foreign number yet, do we change this after approval?
You don't have to. You can always just send me an email to OCASP and I can actually amend your record on the back end.
Perfect. If you have citizenship at your host location, should you use the host location passport instead of Canada?
Okay, so if I'm understanding this right, you're traveling, I'm a French citizen going to France. So embassy information, the contact information that I'm going to be giving would be local authorities. Okay, it doesn't need to be an embassy at that point because you are a citizen. You could do the embassy of your citizenship, but it wouldn't make sense. So if you're a citizen of the country that you're going to, then make sure that you just put the local authority number in there.
Okay, the next question is, what if you're an EU citizen and going to the EU, given the Schengen laws?
Yes.
Would that matter?
The only thing that we say with the Schengen area is you can travel a little bit easier. Of course, in COVID times, during the pandemic, things are a little bit more strict, but just making sure that if you're traveling on your EU passport, just make sure that it's stamped at the entry when you enter each country that you're traveling to. That's the only thing that we would recommend, is that you make sure that immigration actually stamps your passport. And the reason for that is if you were doing the exchange in France, but then you decided to spend a week and travel to another country, if you were stopped by police in the new one, even with the EU passport, they may still want to see your first entry point when you first arrived. Okay.
The next question is, what if my passport is expired, but I have citizenship? The NR won't be valid for you, but my citizenship is valid regardless.
For that, first of all, check with immigration. Okay. Find out if you're still going to need it, the actual passport, or if there's something else. If you don't require it, make sure you get it in writing too. Okay. If you're going to be going through immigration in any other country, you got it in writing what information you were given. But just check with them and find out what the rules are. If you're not required, then in the passport section, you can indicate that you're not required to have it.
Okay, the next question is, if you have dual citizenship, which makes it so you don't have to get a visa for the country you are visiting, but isn't the passport for the country attending, what do you put for dual citizenship? Example, your passport is Canadian and German, but going to school in Italy.
Okay, so you're dual Canadian and German?
Yep, but I'm going to school in Italy.
Okay, that's not what we're looking for in the citizenship area. When we're looking for that, we're looking for dual citizenship with the country that you're going to. If you are a dual Canadian and German citizen, it would be up to you to determine which passport you're going to want to travel on, and then put that embassy information under the government contacts. I hope I understood your question properly.
That's what it said. The next question is, how are we supposed to know what the earliest date we are leaving our home country and the earliest date we are coming back?
You can always go by term dates. If you're not, if it's, I mean, right now the situation is really fluid. So you could still put, if, especially if your term dates start abroad September 9th, you could put September 9th and then even do December 31st at this point. And then not worry about the actual dates. Once you're confirmed, once we get through this whole process, travel is going through and you have your flights, just send me an email and I'll update the record at that time. But choose the term dates if you're not sure.
Okay. The next question is, what are some main hazards that people overlook?
Okay, that's going to be on the checklist that I send you, but one of the main is, well, there's a couple that have been quite frequent lately. Terrorism. There's been a lot of incidents that have happened over the last number of years and continue to happen. So that is something that you would need to be aware of. Demonstrations and protests that have turned quite violent. We have seen a real increase pretty much all over the globe. Those types of things. Driving a vehicle when you're abroad. People often forget that. And the local laws. A lot of people will just say when they're completing their record, I need to know what the laws are. I'll follow the laws. I won't break the law. We actually need you to detail what those laws are, especially the things that are very different than they are here. Okay. In some countries, you might not be able to cover your full face. Something like that, we would want to know that you're aware of it, or any other type of law that is significantly different than what you would expect here. Driving on the left is one that my boss definitely will reject every time if somebody does not indicate it. We've had a lot of students in the past that thought that was kind of a minor thing. You know, they're going to look both ways until they actually were in that environment and they realized that it was their natural response to look for traffic the other way. And we actually did have a student that walked right out in front of a vehicle because he was just automatically looking the other way. Luckily, he was okay. But it's those kinds of things that right now, when you're thinking about it and you're thinking about what the likelihood is that something's going to happen, it might seem very minimal, but indicate it anyway, because it's a potential hazard. I will say that we have very few, before COVID, there was very few situations that required an intervention from our office or even support from International SOS. What we do here a lot is emotional support. When people, you know, it's one thing to think about traveling abroad, but if you are somebody who doesn't travel a lot or maybe has not traveled alone, and this is going to be the first time, and now you're going to be living in a completely different environment, a different cultural context, you may find that you struggle more. Those are the types of things that we have been seeing a lot more before COVID. And those are the types of things that we want you to think about and make sure that you address on your record. But look at the checklist. There will be a whole bunch. Anything that is an automatic that we see regularly that is missed is going to be on the checklist.
Okay, the next question is for hazard and risk. Do we have to include travel risks, sorry, such as a plane crash or car crash?
Not normally. Car crash, if you're going to be driving a vehicle, yes. It's going to really depend on the country profile. There may be some country profiles. I know for some countries, it may see public transportation may be very different. And they may say that it can be hectic and that there is not a lot of laws governing public transportation, and that there is widespread accidents or more accidents than what you would expect. In that case, yes. But plane crash, normally we don't, because if you think about it, how can you mitigate the risk? You can't, unless you just don't go, right? What can you do if it happens? Not a heck of a lot, right? So we're hoping that when you're on a plane going over, you're in the hands of the airline. Okay.
This next question, I think you have answered. For the hazard box, what would be examples of activities to put there that if the only planned required activities are attending classes?
Yeah, if it's the one at the top where it's talking about hazards specific to the activity, you can put not applicable. Okay, unless part of your program actually requires you to scuba dive, which I would think that none of yours would. So for that one, don't even worry about it. You're just going to do the hazards and risks specific to the location, which is the country that you're traveling to.
And you also answered, will exemptions to the travel advisories be granted to commerce undergrads in fall 2021?
Yeah, that is still a wait and see.
Okay.
I hope that the university will be coming out with a decision soon. I would still expect probably around May, we're going to hear something. There is some institutions, some Canadian universities that are starting to come out with what they're doing as far as going back to a more normal existence on campus, which would probably also relate to their mobility programs. But right now it's still, there's a lot of information that is changing quite frequently. So right now, don't worry about it unless the university decides that there will not be, that they're suspending the fall exchange and you still want to go. Then you would need to reach out to your faculty. Otherwise, don't even worry about it.
Okay, the next question is, what level of detail is expected in the safety planning record?
A lot of detail. Okay. The when I'm reviewing your record, or when Dan is reviewing it as the final approver, or even when your faculty is for the MIB and the MBA students, your faculties might have a little bit more information about you personally than our office does, but they're still not going to have a lot of detail about your personal circumstances. Okay. So keep that in mind when you're doing your hazards and risks section. We don't know if you've traveled a lot. We don't know if this is the first time that you're traveling. We don't know if this is a country that you've traveled to often. For people that are European citizens and you're going to be in Europe, that's part of your risk mitigation plan for a lot of these types of potential hazards. You are already aware of them because already traveled there, if you have, or you may have spent time there or have family there. That kind of stuff should be incorporated into your record, but we won't know that. So we're going to be looking for a lot of detail. When you first log into OCAS, on the first page, there is a link to an example of a good good OCAS record. It's a PDF version that you can download, and it gives you some additional information on what we expect in each one of those fields, and what we expect in the risks and hazards section. And it'll give you some examples, some further examples. But as much detail as you can. Just keep it in the back of your mind that we don't know what's going on with you. And we want to see everything very well detailed.
Okay, the next question is, what do I do if I am banned from traveling to my country?
That's a really good question. First of all, if you were banned from traveling to your host country, let your faculty office know immediately, and then we'll converse with your faculty office. Okay.
Okay. The next question, somebody's trying to activate their net ID, but it's not letting them complete it.
Oh, okay. You could reach out to your faculty office. You can also reach out to Queen's ITS. Okay, there's probably a link that you can contact them directly on the ITS webpage. You can also call them directly if that is feasible for you. They would be 1-613-533-6666. Again, that's 1-613-533-6666. They're open Monday to Friday. They're now open quite extended hours. I think they're now even answering at 6 o'clock in the morning until 6, 7, 8 o'clock at night. Call them directly or check in with your faculty office.
The next question, is there a checklist of information we need to fill out on the OCAS form in case we want to compile the information before we start filling out the form?
You can use the checklist. Only thing that I would recommend is if you're going to be doing the work ahead of time before you actually fill it out in the OCAS record itself. We have had a number of students do this that thought it was a little bit easier for them to do that, especially because of the timeout situation. They didn't want to take a chance that it was going to time out on them. They were doing that work and copying and pasting it into a Word document. And then what they did afterwards, once they were ready to complete their OCAS record, then they only had to cut and paste the information that they've already done into the record. It's however you want to do it.
Where would they find the checklist?
The checklist, actually, I'm going to be sending out an email to the faculty offices first thing Monday morning. You'll be getting it pretty early. They will be getting it pretty early that has a modified checklist with some more detailed information and the links for that, and they can provide it to you. But also, once you're in the OCAS system itself, I believe it is the pre-departure modules, there is one that says how to complete a risk assessment. That module is going to give you information similar to what we've discussed here now, and it's going to have the checklist that you can print off there. You can also email me at ocasp@queensu.ca, and I'll directly send it to you.
Okay, the next question is, to ensure the OCAS record we submit is the most up-to-date as possible, when would you recommend we submit our record?
I would recommend that you submit your records if we need to have them approved. And I'm talking about the fall people right now. The fall people, your record needs to be approved by July 1st. I would recommend that you are working on it in April and May. And for sure, by the end of May, you've submitted it the first time. That will give us more than enough time to go back and forth with you to have it approved before
Okay.
July 1st.
The next questions is, are all international SOS services free? For example, if medical or counseling needs to be set up, is the cost of the service covered by the insurance, or does the student owe money to ISOS?
Good question, really good question. The types of services that International SOS provide, normally you don't have to pay out of pocket, okay? With our contract with the university and International SOS, a lot of this stuff is covered, but some of it then might still require reimbursement from your insurance company, okay? There were instances where a few people went and had medical attention or had to seek medical attention and weren't able to pay for it up front. They were able to get ISOS paid for it. ISOS worked with the university to ensure that that was paid for ahead of time. And then we worked with the insurance provider of the student to get reimbursed. So normally you're not going to have to pay for those ahead of time. Counseling appointments, there is, under our contract, there is a certain number that they provide, which has usually been quite adequate. So I don't foresee that there will be out-of-pocket expenses unless your insurance doesn't cover something. So that's where you really want to know, is COVID-related illnesses covered by your insurance? Is medical emergency evacuation covered? Those types of things, particular, they will do the extraction, but then it will be the insurance company that's going to provide the reimbursement.
This is on the same line.
Okay.
Can you still call International SOS or OCASP if you're doing personal travel during your exchange if you need help?
If you're doing personal travel during your exchange, yes, you can still reach out to International SOS, especially if it's if you're doing personal travel during the time that you're abroad. So you're going to be out for the full fall term and you might be doing traveling on weekends. Absolutely. Make sure that you have the information for SOS, International SOS, and you contact them. That's why I say make sure that you download their app. Okay.
The next question is, will Queen's help with any vaccine scheduling if vaccine passports are mandated before our exchange?
That is something that I could not answer. Let's just table that for right now until we see what is going to happen. I will be following up with this with my boss, Dan Langham, in the coming weeks. But if there is going to be anything like that, there will be some kind of notification that will be coming out either from the university or through the faculty offices that will be coming from administration. Okay.
The next question is, I am supposed to go to Italy in September for MIB. If travel is not allowed, am I able to complete the Queen's portion first if travel is not allowed? Sorry.
And was this a summer?
I'm supposed to go to Italy in September.
Oh, okay.
If travel is not allowed, am I able to complete the Queen's portion first if travel is not allowed?
Okay. What we are going to say is definitely complete OCASP. Make sure that you get that approved, because even if travel is not allowed, you may be able to apply for an exemption. You will need to have your OCASP approved before they will allow an exemption. So that's going to be part of the exemption process, should that become necessary. So make sure that you do the OCASP stuff first. And then if travel is suspended, then you can look at whether or not you still want to seek an exemption and what that requires you to do. But your record would need to do that. Now, having said that, if you are scheduled to go in fall, and maybe they do suspend all fall travel, but they decide that you decide you're going to go in winter then. You've already done your record. It's already approved. it's already sitting in the system. So even if your travel gets pushed off to the winter term, all we have to do is open up that record and change the dates once you are actually confirmed to travel at a later date. Okay, that's the same if you are planning to go to a specific country and host institution now. If something happens and you are not able to go to that particular country and that institution and need to go to a different location, your record is already there. It's already been approved. We can open it up and amend it based on your new location. So it's going to save you a lot of time and energy, and I can work directly with you on getting the record now updated for a new location. Okay.
Perfect. And then does ISOS overlap with medical insurance that we are required to obtain?
No. Very, very good question. A lot of people get confused about international SOS and think it's actually some type of insurance as well. They're not an insurance company at all. They do provide additional insurance, but that's not our contract with them. Our contract with them is safety and security and health. So it's making sure that they are available to respond to emergencies immediately and are able to get helicopters in the air and get out and get somebody. Okay, that's what they're going to provide. You are not going to be required to pay for any additional insurance through them.
And then I noticed that Alan Chen has his hand up. I didn't know if you wanted me to unmute him so he could ask his question.
Sure.
Yep. Alan? Oh, you know what? He's gone now.
Oh,
Okay.
might be getting a little bit long. Sorry about that.
And the last question that is here is just wondering, when is the end of this session?
Oh, actually, if that's the last question, we're done. Okay. Sorry that it took a little bit longer. In this particular climate, it's a little bit different than other years in the planning process. So just make sure that you start your OCASP earlier. There will be a little bit more detailed information that you'll need to, strictly because of the COVID situation and different travel restrictions that keep coming up. But other than that, the only other thing was our technical difficulties at the beginning. So thank you very much for sticking through it with us. I do see there's one last saying that you were late for the session, and will it be recorded? Yes, it will. The information will be coming out from your faculty offices on where you can get a copy of this recording, as well as any additional information will be coming to you. But other than that, for any other types of questions now, make sure that you email me directly at ocas@queensu.ca, and I will respond to them directly. And it looks like that might be it. Anything else from Tom, Haley, or Jacoba?
I just want to say thanks, Sandra, for that session, and thanks for all the great questions. I know that this is probably not how lots of folk want to spend their Saturday night if they're in Ontario or other times, depending where they are in the world. So thank you for bearing with us. I just want to reiterate that OCASP is a great tool for helping you plan your travel. And although it may not always look exciting, it is really valuable. We really encourage you to take it seriously, because it's going to stand you in good stead for when you are overseas. So please do take the time to complete it thoroughly and do it well the first time. That will make Sandra's job a lot easier, and also make your life a lot easier, because you won't have to go back and make any amendments. So we really hope that you do find this tool useful, and it maybe encourages you to think about things that you haven't thought about for your travel, because there is a lot to consider. Yeah, so thanks again, Sandra.
Thanks, Sandra. Everything that Tom just said, ditto. Great, thank you for this.
And just the last thing is just to reiterate that while you're doing your research, not only is this to protect you while you're abroad and to get you thinking about what could potentially go wrong, it's also to make sure that you are thinking about your personal comfort level at this point. And if you have any concerns especially while you're going through this process and maybe thinking now that fall isn't going to be the best, make sure that you reach out immediately to your faculty offices. And other than that, as I mentioned at the beginning, very few times do we ever have any incidents that go wrong. This process can be a little bit daunting at times, but it's to make sure that you're prepared and to make sure that once you actually arrive abroad, that if anything happens, you've already considered it, you've already thought of it, you've got your plan, you know what to do, okay? We just want you to have a wonderful time abroad, okay? And I think with that, if there's any other questions, email me directly. Otherwise, thank you very much again for sticking through this with us. And I hope you have a wonderful weekend.
I'm going to stop the recording now.
Good night, everyone.